Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to the Data Measurement and Analytics playlist here with the training, learning, and development community. Appreciate you coming in. Thank you for joining us. Today's guest is A.D. Detrick, sorry.
Detrick.
I'm really glad that he volunteered to join us this morning. I was really excited to see a lot of what he had written online, his work with Metroverse. He's a strategy and measurement consultant, human capital analytics expert, project manager, instructional designer, and trainer. I'm taking this straight from your bio off the Metroverse website.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Prior to founding Metroverse Analytics, he worked as the principal measurement consultant for Xerox Global Learning Services and Intrepid Learning. Definitely know about Intrepid Learning. They're an industry leader in consulting, technology, and research. And you've been speaking and writing about our industry for over a decade.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very nice to meet you.
Yeah.
So you're going to be talking about getting a seat at the table using analytics, data measurement and analytics. I just want to start out with, can you just describe what the table is exactly?
Yeah. Well, I think so. I've been in a rare position in that I've been in the industry for about 21 years. 20 of those have been measuring the effectiveness of training. So I've been really lucky. A lot of people haven't had that opportunity to get into measurement until data started to expand, in recent years. And the thing that I have always heard from training is, we don't get a seat at the table. When it comes to making intelligent decisions, business-focused decisions, we never seem to have that seat at the table. And there are kind of the ways we look at learning, not just in learning and development, but the way corporate America, the way organizations look at learning, I think they kind of paint us into a corner where we're not actually able to get in that conversation. And so what I found, and we'll kind of talk about today, is a lot of the work that I've done is on how do we assess that learning has occurred. And once we have that data in place, then it's not an issue of fighting for a seat at the table, fighting for that opportunity to be heard, fighting for that opportunity to voice our concerns or our thoughts. It's more about leading that conversation. And so as I always kind of tell clients, I said, look, if you measure your learning correctly, you're not fighting for the seat at the table, you're going to take the head of the table, because somebody has to be in a position to have that conversation. And it's always the team with the best data that does. And very few people are really in a position to enter that conversation with any data, much less really good data. So if we have good data, we're able to really lead that conversation. That's kind of what I'll talk about today as much as I can, given time constraints and technical difficulties and everything else. So,
and I think that's so relevant. It's like whoever can have the best data. And I think that is basically the transformation all of organizations are going to be going through now, is now that there's this element that exists, the ability to acquire data and transform it into how you are actually supporting the business. That is, that's who is going to be, leading the table. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and disappear here so that I can let you talk.
Sure. I can share some PowerPoint slides, as many as I've got. So I apologize to everybody. There was some difficulty this morning with technical stuff, and I do want to talk about measurement, and I'm going to talk specifically about assessments when we talk today, because one of the, give me a second here, there we go. One of the critical factors that I think that we tend to sort of give ourselves a little short shrift on when it comes to measurement is how we assess. And I think that we think of, now that we're in a world with a ton of data, that we're probably in a position to gather as much data as we can about as many factors as we can, and then try and figure out what of that data is meaningful. And the reality is, I tend to focus a lot in my work on assessments as really the sort of critical pieces of data that we want. And so I want to talk a little bit early on, and I apologize. I want to just make sure that everybody is seeing my screen. Sorry, give me a second. All right, this is where there's always got to be that one guy. It really is. I don't know where the captions came from. All right, I apologize. So we want to talk about how we are, how we think about measurement. And probably the most common commentary that I get when we talk about measurement is the idea that we want to map our work to business goals. So we have learning and development, and then that learning and development has to map to some kind of behavioral or performance change on the job. And then that behavior or performance change will, in effect, change a business goal for the better. That line is probably the most commonly talked about phrase when we think about measurement. It implies this linear correlation that learning leads to behavior, behavior leads to improved business goals. As learning development improves, behaviors change. As behaviors improve, business goals are achieved. And that's a fairly logical perspective to take. And it's in line with everything that we already do. It's pretty rare in reality that any of us are in a business that doesn't follow that line, that we expect people's performance to positively impact the business goal that's in aligned with our bottom line. So just the idea of mapping to business goals is something that we already do. In general, after all these years on the job, I don't see many people who aren't doing that. And so we think about traditional learning measurement in that way. We're just trying to correlate our activities with behavioral change, trying to correlate our behavioral changes with performance impact. Model. So we give learning and development, we provide learning and development, but the behaviors don't change. Within that linear model, the response is, oh, then obviously training is flawed and we need to retrain these people. So my goal is always to really talk about with clients that we need to know and understand what L&D can actually control. Because within that linear model, we're saying we operate under the belief that having the knowledge and the skills and ability to perform a task, that it will always lead in that linear fashion to proper performance. And as I say on the slide, which is a good theory if you ignore everything we know about psychology and human behavior. And the reality is that's what's kind of kept us in this strange model. We think in terms of that linear correlation, and we think in terms that having knowledge, skills, and ability will lead to proper performance. And the reality is that's not very true. And so I always like to kind of talk about behavioral engineering and what it takes to change behavior. And that there are three aspects to that. So there's ability, just having the knowledge, the skills, and the access to the proper information. There's opportunity, and that's that you're aligned with the ability to enact these tasks or these behaviors, that you have access to the resources that will let you show these behaviors or exhibit these behaviors. And then there's sort of an intrinsic internal component, which I call motivation. So do we have a purpose? Do we understand why we're doing it? Are we being held accountable to do it? Is someone paying attention and making sure we're doing it and that we're doing it properly? And are we being compensated or incentivized to do that? So if you study behavioral engineering, there are a bunch of different models, but all of them kind of boil down to these three components. Now they get a little more detailed as you go through, but they all kind of boil down to those three components: ability, opportunity, and motivation. So these are the things that change people's behaviors. And the reality is our focus is on a very limited range of influence within that picture. And we all know this. So I don't think that I've ever had this discussion with anyone in L&D who doesn't know this intrinsically, but understands that the way we're viewed within our organizations and the way we're viewed as an industry within the larger, collective work world, is not this. So we know that we're held responsible for knowledge and skills and access to information, people's ability to change their behaviors. That's what we can influence. Yet we're held accountable for the behavior on whole and not held accountable for things that we can't influence. We can't provide opportunity. We might be able to motivate a little, but it's not very likely. And we certainly can't be held accountable for whether we motivate or not. In reality, we have a very small picture in which we can, really show our influence. And the questions that we should be able to answer when we're talking about behavioral changes that affect that business, the questions we should be able to answer are, did they learn, right? Can we show that they have the knowledge and the skills and ability to perform the task? If they didn't learn, what did we do to fix that, right? Did we retrain? Did we remediate? Did we provide some kind of job aid or flow of work support? And then do they have the necessary knowledge resources to perform properly? So did they need extra job aids? Do they need procedural documentation, helpline? Do they need any kind of support that is not training in order to make sure that job gets done? These are the questions that we should be able to answer at the end of learning. And the main way that we can do that is to focus on learner assessment. So we have different ways to measure how we're going to map to those business goals. So we can measure, as you see on the slide, attendance, participation, and completion, right? And that tells us that people did attend learning. They did take part in a learning intervention. And then a learner reaction, what we'll sometimes call smile sheets, pejoratively. Some people, think of it as the Kirkpatrick level 1. There are different models out there. I know Will Thalheimer has a new model that talks about learner reactions and doing that in an intelligent way. We want to talk about how learners felt about the learning experience. And then we go into assessing them, and we can assess them. And you'll see that there's a little overlap here, because I don't only think of assessment as just something we do as part of the learning experience, as part of the course. I also think of it in terms of going out and assessing if the behavior has changed on the job. So if you think in terms of Kirkpatrick, we're talking kind of about level 2 and level 3. These are some of those middle tiers in the new LTEM model. Most models will kind of talk about that. And then obviously we want to look at that business impact that tells us if those business goals were met. If we're not properly assessing our learning, if we're just saying they went to training, they attended learning, we put them through, they participated, they took the e-learning, they clicked through the whole course, they did whatever. If we only have evidence that people completed learning, that they did an activity, or if we only have evidence that they completed learning and they liked it or didn't like it, how they reacted to it. Without assessment, the original argument that linear correlation between learning and development and a lack of a business goal, lack of meeting a business goal, if we don't meet the business goal and all we have is they attended learning and they liked it, right? We have level 1, level 0, and level 1, as some people will call it. If we only have that, the argument that they were not trained properly, that learning was flawed and they need to be retrained, is a much more compelling argument. We don't have the data necessary to say, now wait a minute, a lot of things go into this business impact, and our part, learning, is not the cause of it. So we have to have that proper assessment in the middle. in order to be able to have that conversation, and in order to stop that narrative that has existed for far too many decades that says if the business impact is not met, send them back to training. Training was flawed. They need to relearn this. So assessment becomes a really, really critical component when we're talking about learning measurement and we're talking about learning analytics. And as I said to Luis a minute ago, so when behavior doesn't change, now when behavior does change, this slide doesn't mention what happens when behavior does change. When behavior does change, what happens? Everybody goes about their day, right? If you go to a restaurant and have a really great meal, you don't then walk into the kitchen and demand that the chef explain what he did to create a really good meal. You just enjoy it. And in reality, if we train and a business need, that business need is met, nobody asks us, hey, you did a really great job. How did you do that? But when a behavior doesn't change, the team with the best data drives that conversation. So if we're thinking in terms of changing behavior, of engineering behavior, I like the phrase behavioral engineering, because that's really what it is. If we're thinking in terms of changing behavior or engineering behavior, we have to think in terms of ability, opportunity, and motivation. And on the screen are some of the groups that affect those. So for ability, learning and development comes to the table. For opportunity, it's executive stakeholders, frontline managers, IT. For motivation, there's HR, there's recruiting. Did we hire the right people? Are we giving the right people the right benefits package? Are we overseeing their career development well enough? Finance, are we compensating them or incentivizing them well enough? All of these different areas affect people's ability, opportunity, and motivation to change their behaviors in order to change their work. And it really is our responsibility and our ability, now that we have good data around assessments, to say, let's talk about behavioral engineering and let's all sit down at the table and let's show how we contributed to these changes. And my testament, and because I haven't seen otherwise in 2 decades now of doing this, is that if that conversation needs to be had, L&D is usually the only people who can come to that conversation with actual data. Now, some of that is the result of the narrative that we've been living under for decades and decades, because everybody assumes training or learning and development will put the situation right. Their job is to move everything forward. If that behavioral change doesn't happen, they'll go back and retrain them until it does. So nobody thinks to gather a lot of data around this, but we have very clear data that we can bring forward to show that, look, people have the ability to enact these changes. People have the ability to do the tasks required to meet these business goals. If they're not doing them, let's talk about why. But it's not our problem, and it's not something that always gets pushed back on us. And so what you find is that properly designed and properly thought out assessments really give you the ability to have that conversation. That conversation is really the only conversation that causes people to feel training is devalued and doesn't have a place at the table, isn't allowed to express their opinion, that their thoughts aren't very valued. And so it's really a critical point for us to do that. Now, having said that, and I'm not able to see if people are, let me just make sure that nobody's putting any messages. Okay, cool. How do we identify any gaps and identify this? So, okay, we can talk about, and I'm not sure, unfortunately, I'm kind of going off a different screen. So I can talk about that in a minute, Mark, but we'll talk through, give me a second here. There we go. Okay, so one of the problems with assessments is how we think about them as an industry. And I think one of the biggest disservices that I hear on a regular basis, and one that concerns me the most, is people talk about, when they think about assessments, first off, they think only in terms of Kirkpatrick level 2. And if you were to sit, as I have done, and ask people to describe what Kirkpatrick level 2 looks like, it generally looks like we create a course, and at the end of the course, someone gets together, because we've been told that there's only going to be 5 minutes at the end of the course, at the end of the 2-hour course, to give a quiz, and we hastily throw together a 3-question quiz at the end of the course. And we don't know much about how to write tests, and we don't know much about what those best practices are. We simply toss together this hastily crafted quiz. We throw it at the end of the course, and then everybody is expected to get 100, or everybody is expected to pass, or we throw some arbitrary standard on it. And so I'm not denying that assessments have a pretty bad history, to the point where in recent years there's been a lot of talk about, oh, we have great data, we don't need to assess anymore. We don't need to take a look at measuring our learning anymore, because we can measure other things. We can measure activity. We can measure engagement. We can take surveys and measure, the reactions a little deeper. Because we've done these level 2s, or because we've done what are technically called criterion reference assessments so bad for so long, we really now don't value them very much, and we don't see them as being very important. And part of that was a technological limitation. So when I started in this industry, every test had to be given manually, and it had to be given paper-based. And that was just how it was. So every class you went in and you gave a paper-based assessment, and everybody marked it up with a pen. And then the trainer at the end of the training course would have a big stack of assessments that he would grade, or she would grade. And that was it. There was nothing else to really be done with it. There wasn't any place to record it. There wasn't any place to track it. There wasn't any place to consider it. And if we were to do any actual analysis on it, it would require putting all of that manually into another system. So we are not there anymore. That doesn't exist anymore. So now we have to think about assessment in terms of a world where we have the ability to really analyze the data around assessments, and stop thinking of it just as a hastily crafted quiz that we put at the end of a course, and start thinking of it in terms of a useful tool for really showing that we have taught people the knowledge, skills, and ability in order to change their behaviors. So part of what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to answer some questions, or be able to explain, if we do have to sit down with other stakeholders, what were the components that went into our design in an assessment strategy. So I've kind of broken them down into 4 questions, or couple, or kind of multiple point questions. But what are the metrics of an effective assessment? How do we design with those in mind? When should we assess? How will we assess? So some talk around what kind of cognitive levels should we assess at? And then what actions will we take from these results? Because again, we have a long history of just giving assessments that then turn into a score that we pretty much ignore from that point on. So one of the kind of critical points when we're thinking about assessment is, what does assessment mean from a statistical perspective? Now, there is a very detailed and very credible school of statistics around assessment called psychometrics. It's complex. It is kind of multivariate. There are a number of different variables that will enact and they'll kind of counteract each other. And so you have to know quite a bit. Psychometrics isn't just a quick read and we pick up and we go with it. And I'll admit that. But the goal of all psychometric analysis is to get a defensible assessment. and that meets certain statistical standards of reliability and validity. And I want to talk about reliability and validity for a minute, because they're important concepts to understand, even if you don't have the statistical background to show them. And so when we talk about tests being reliable and valid, a reliable test measures how consistently a question is measuring its results. So if I give this test to, I've given this test to 100 people. If I give this test to 100 more, how likely is it that that 100 more is going to score similar to the first 100? So that's reliability, how well it's measuring results, how consistently it's measuring results. Validity is certainty that we're measuring what we intend to measure, okay? And so this is the ability to say, look, we're measuring that people are learning, not that people are guessing and getting the answer. This is statistically taking out any concern that people are cheating, that people are taking a test that was written really poorly. And so if you've ever studied like standardized tests or seen standardized tests, the way they can tell people are cheating is generally through validity metrics. And so those are kind of the two different statistical components we're looking for. So at the bottom, I've kind of given some sense. So if a test is not reliable or not valid, means that the test results are all over the place, that all the questions, when they're answered, you might be a high scoring person on the test, but you got this question wrong, whereas a person who has a low scoring person on the test got this question, scored it right. That there's no certainty. If I give this test to another group, I don't know what they're going to score. I don't know how well they're going to score. That's an unreliable, invalid test. A test that's reliable but not valid consistently measures something, but we don't know that we're measuring what we intend to measure. So a perfect example of this, how many of you have taken tests where everybody on the test scored 100? Worse yet, how many of you have been a part of training organizations who have delivered tests that require everyone to score 100, right? That's a consistent result. That's a reliable result, right? Because we know everybody is going to score 100. Or on the other hand, how many of us have taken tests where everybody failed and everybody failed miserably? Still a reliable test because we know that consistently everybody is going to fail that test. But it's not reliable because we don't see that it's measuring what it's intended to measure. We don't know if everybody scores 100 that they scored 100 because they were learning, versus maybe everybody got the answers ahead of time, or maybe everybody cheated, or maybe the question was written really easy. We've all taken those tests that, you have 10 questions and they're all so easy, you didn't even need to take the material. That's a reliable test that's not valid. So what we're looking for is tests that are both reliable, that we know everybody will score similar as time goes on. That the longer we give this test, the more certainty we can say everybody will score between 75 and 100. But also valid, that we can see through the metrics that that's a result of learning. So to get the statistics behind this, that is pretty complex. The advantage that you have is that everything every learning model is set up to do, and everything that every best practice that exists around assessment is set up to do, it exists to optimize those statistical results. Everything we know about assessment best practices, everything we know about assessment is all rooted in those statistics that tell us this is how to create a defensible test. So you don't need to know the statistics to follow the best practices around assessment and make valid choices, knowing that the goal of it is to create these defensible assessments, to create the assessments that you can say, I can say with some confidence that people learned. How can I say that? Well, we followed all of these best practices. And as a result, we can say people learned, what data do you have, in those situations? So.
Hey, AD, just a quick
Yes,
question
sir.
here. I've got a question from Rick. And
Yes.
he asks, what if the business goal is 100% of people trained are capable of performing duties assigned to them 100% of the time?
Okay. Yeah. And so that's fine. So our goal now, remember, our goal isn't going to be held accountable for them doing it 100% of the time. So them performing it 100% of the time is the responsibility of their managers. Our goal is to make sure that we have taught people how to do it and we can assess it. And we'll kind of, as we're going through some of these, we'll talk about it. But one of the questions that I asked, if you remembered, was what would we do? I'm not going to go all the way back because I'll get lost. I've proven myself non-technical enough today. But one of the goals that we have is, what do we do about people who haven't learned, right? What are we going to use this feedback for? So, and it's a common question. Company wants everybody to be able to do this job and they need them to do it 100% of the time. I work in a lot of regulated environments where that is the goal. You can't make a mistake. We can't afford to have you make the mistake. If we put them through training, what are we going to find? We're going to find that a valid and reliable assessment, some people are going to get questions wrong. That's just the reality of it. That's the only way we can find valid and reliable data. But since we're tracking that some people are going to get this wrong because it's a hard concept, now we've got information about who got concepts wrong. We have, for a long time as an industry, put people through tests and then forgotten about them. We put them through the course and we forget about them. One of the things that an assessment strategy allows us to do and encourages us to do is to use that feedback to provide remediation, to provide ongoing support, to identify, hey, by the way, you, frontline manager, we put 10 of your people through this training and the expectation is they will do it perfectly every time. Here are the people who missed, important concepts in that course. You may want to watch them for that. You may want to follow up with them for that. As opposed to holding ourselves accountable that everybody knows 100% of the material 100% of the time, which creates completely invalid, statistically invalid assessments, like literally invalid, 0, totally invalid if everybody scores 100. Rather than hold ourselves accountable to that, and then hope that now that we've given them an invalid assessment, hopefully they will go back on the job and do their job because they're going to hold us accountable. Our responsibility is to make sure that they learn in a valid and reliable way, and then use that data to give them as much support as we can. And then if they don't, to have that hard conversation about, look, they knew how to do the job. They were given extra support as a result of the training because we knew who was at risk of not being able to do that job. And if they didn't, let's talk with these other groups about possibly why they didn't, because it wasn't the result of not knowing. And so it's a good question. And like I said, I work in a lot of regulated environments right now that have to be very, very concerned about, a single infraction. So you have 25,000 people, but we've got to watch all of them because they can't have one infraction. So it's a common thing. And it really is, again, rethinking our position at that table. So we really had to get them out of that idea that they would be responsible for making sure everybody committed to 100% correct on the test, and then just sitting back and hoping and praying they didn't make any mistakes. So good question on that.
I got another one here, AD.
Yeah, please.
This one is from Eric B, and he's asking, what about asking knowledge checks within the course after each topic to make sure learners are getting it before moving to the next item?
Yep. Yeah. And you can do, so knowledge checks have the exact same unfortunate history as the level 2. So we just kind of think of knowledge checks as things we're not going to grade, things we're not going to track, things we're not going to be that. So when we think about knowledge checks, especially looking at this slide, knowledge checks are a good way, and we can run the exact same kind of analysis, and we should probably think about knowledge checks the way we think about kind of final assessments, right? Post-course assessments. They yield a lot of information. And sometimes the information they just yield is people are clicking through this because they want to get through the course. Still good, valid information that we can use. But yeah, no, knowledge checks are another good source of information. If they're done correctly, they'll yield a lot of information. And I'm actually working on a project with a client right now where instead of one single post-course assessment, we're actually using knowledge check questions basically throughout the modules. Now, as you can see on the screen here, now there are pros and cons to when we assess people. So during, which would be knowledge checks, or immediately following learning, the pro of that is, what are we seeing? We're really seeing the effect of learning and development's efforts, right? We know that if you know this answer, you know it because you learned it from us, if the test is valid and reliable. The problem with it is that it's really most likely due to short-term memory. I think Will Thalheimer calls it knowledge replication. I think it was basically that, look, we're just kind of regurgitating what we just learned. So I don't know that 2 days from now you will be able to apply that. Still good data, and it has, like I said, all of these have pros and cons. There isn't a right answer around when we should assess, but you need to know the pros and cons of each. I can give you my personal push with my clients is I generally try and do as much of this as possible. So try and do an immediate, like a post-course assessment at the very least. And then if they can go back and do another assessment 2 or 3 days down the road. And those assessments are going to be a little different, and we'll talk about those on the next slide. But if you can do an assessment just a couple days, right when that forgetting curve starts to happen, so we can make sure they've retained that information, that they still have it. And that's not necessarily as much a result of, okay, they went back to the job and now they've done it 600 times. So, and then longer term, if we can go in and assess just one last time, doesn't have to be everybody. It doesn't have to be, if it was a 50 question test, post-course assessment, it doesn't have to be another 50 question test. We don't have to pull them into a room. There are a number of different ways we can test, but we want to take a look down the road to make sure they're actually applying it. The down the road con, if we only choose that method, is we don't know if that's the result of our efforts, what we taught them, or did they go into that class? Did they sleep through the whole class and then go out and their neighbor sitting next to them on the job taught them how to do it? We don't know how much responsibility we can take for the down the road. So I always try and find a mix of the three as much as we can. The reality is the business often won't allow it. They won't fund it. They won't support it. So we have to kind of fight for the reasons why we pick the right projects on which to do. But I always start from that framework that I would like to look at. What did they learn immediately? So we know that it's specific to L&D and our efforts. What did they learn soon after, so that we can gauge how well they've retained it, even though there might be a little bit of on-the-job practicality, getting into that. And then go back in the long term and say, are they able to apply it? Are they actually able to do the tasks to the standards and the criteria that the business wants? And that shows those deeper levels of learning. And so when we talk about how we should assess, there are kind of three. Oh, that's a multiple. Okay, good. Good catch. I just saw a typo in here. I apologize. When we think about how we should assess, and I kind of like to start with this. So there's a really good book you can see at the bottom of the screen. And it's a book I recommend. It's a textbook, and it's kind of the Bible for anybody who does assessment on a regular basis. And it's called Criterion Reference Test Development, and by Cosarelli and Schock. And they really brought up that there are kind of three ways to think about assessing. We can do scenario-based decisions, right? This is what you're used to in the post-course assessments. A multiple choice question that's based on a scenario. Here's the situation. Now you have to choose what is the correct answer. The other option is simulation. So we create a fake environment, whether it's on a computer, whether it's a fake environment that we're kind of watching you do on paper, whether it is a sandbox environment. So it's still your workstation, but it's not a production environment. And sometimes we can even do interviews or surveys to talk about how you've done things. But the idea that we have the scenario-based decisions, which is completely kind of made up scenario. There's simulations, which are fake scenarios, and then also real world experience. So on that previous slide, there's always a mix of these. So obviously, if we're in class or during or immediately, we probably are going to mostly stick with those scenario-based decision making and simulations. Whereas as we go into more long-term, that's where we start looking at real world observations and really paying attention to people and seeing, are they doing what we expect them to do? So, so given that, okay, sorry, that's a wrong slide there. So this is how we think. So when we're creating these different, environments, really our main goal is to just create assessments using some of the best practices that we have around this. And so one of the things that I don't have, unfortunately, because of the technical difficulties that I have, is the slides that I was going to show you around some of the best practices around that. So I'm going to tease this with, I think I've got a Word doc. Here we go. So those of you in the TLDC community obviously know Kara North, and I know that Kara has done a number of sessions where she talks about things like this. So this is a QA checklist that I share with my clients, and I have a copy that if anybody wants, I can share after this session.
Hey, AD, we're not actually seeing. I'm not seeing the Word doc.
Oh, you're not seeing it? Okay.
If you could
I don't know what I'm doing.
Also, just want to throw a comment out to you that Laura just posted. Really helpful for higher ed environments too.
Yes.
The tried and true multiple choice test is so boring. Need new and innovative ways to help students succeed.
Yeah, and it's nice to see it coming back around. So all of the stuff we know about the statistics behind assessment came from higher ed, and now it's kind of turning higher ed around. So it's really nice that now corporate America and for-profit organizations are finally realizing how to do assessments in a really good way, and now it's starting to affect higher ed again. So that's been one of the nice kind of changes of corporate America actually getting the data that it needs to do this. But I don't know if you can see it or not, but if not, I've got some best practice checklists, and like I was saying, Kara is currently touring around talking about some of these best practices. And it's really about how to create proper, how to construct, rather. What are the kind of construction issues, the guidelines that you should follow when you're constructing a criterion reference assessment, when you're constructing a decision-based scenario? And what are the proper guidelines, the QA guidelines, when you're constructing an observation of a behavior, or when you're kind of looking at a simulation? Those best practices exist as a result of years of statistical psychometric study. So we find that questions that are written a specific way, that they should have certain number of answer options, or that we should word question stems in a specific way. All of those are based in statistical findings to create the most valid and reliable assessments possible. And so these are just some guidelines that I like to say that, so you don't need to know the advanced statistics required to say my test is defensible. If you can just say, look, we followed all of these best practices to make sure that we were creating valid, reliable assessments. We created assessments that measured all of the learning objectives. And then we went back in and measured it a few different ways to make sure that not only did they learn it in learning, but they were able to apply it. If we have that information, even if you don't know how to do the detailed statistics, that information coupled with What did you do with that feedback? So what did I do with the information about the people who didn't seem to learn? What did I do with the people who scored 40% on the assessment? What did I do with the people who absolutely did not learn learning objective 14 because everybody got it wrong? What did I do about that? Coupled with all of that information, you would not believe the power you wield in business decisions, particularly around business decisions in situations where people are trying to change behaviors that aren't changing very well. And what's really important is this isn't just a defensive stance, right? You're not taking that information and just saying, hey, it wasn't my fault. You're actually able to take that information and start to incentivize other people to try and fix how they're affecting those behaviors and how they're influencing those behaviors, and really trying to drive accountability in the organization. So like I said, it goes from taking that defensive place where you're not even considered and you don't have a seat at the table, to taking the head of the table and really helping people drive their own accountability. And so it sounds like you had a question, Luis.
Oh no, actually, I actually have a hard stop at 9 a.m.
Okay.
12 p.m. Eastern, and and I love this. I'm going to go ahead and pop back on screen here, and just
please.
This has been fantastic, AD. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I think that it would be kind of, maybe we could get you back on with Kara, and we might be able to talk about that checklist. I'm sure she would absolutely love that. And
we're both in Columbus, Ohio, so it would be.
Ohio's like the hotbed of instructional designers.
It is. Yeah.
What is up with that? But
we're the Silicon Valley of instructional design right now.
Oh, that's the first time I've heard that. I believe it. But I wanted just to thank you so much for your talk today, and I really would love to do a follow up. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but
all my fault. I apologize.
Oh, it's okay. Let me. There would definitely be a recording available, Katie. Thank you so much, and Eric, thanks for your comments, Rick, and we will definitely have AD back on again, and this is such an important topic to discuss, right? There's just instructional designers, especially, there's a wide spectrum of skill sets that it seems like instructional designers have to take on. And so this data piece is such an important thing. And I'm so glad that we've connected with AD and that we're able to get his insights into it. And we will definitely have him back on next time. So
that'd be great. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Follow up. And AD, where can people get a hold of you if they want to get in touch with you?
Yeah, get a hold of me on LinkedIn. A.D.Detrick is my name there. And so I'm on LinkedIn. And then I'm at adetrick at metroverse.com, which is my analytics company. So, and you can find us at metroverse.com on the web. So,
okay. Yeah. All right. And if you want, if you could send me maybe that checklist, and I'll put it on in our Slack work group, and then Perfect. Have that available to folks. And let's see, any chance you're going to be at Devlin this week?
No, unfortunately, I'm traveling this week. So I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Katie, the recording will be actually here, the same link. Once this wraps up, it kind of just it wraps up, and then you'll see that there's a play button available. And thank you everyone for coming in.
Thanks everybody.
Next week we have Elham Arabi is going to be in, and her discussion is called "Make Your Learning Design More Effective Through Learning Analytics," and that's the final session of this series. But we'll probably have AD back, and we'll just add to this playlist. So thanks everybody.
Awesome. Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
See ya.